Good afternoon. Thank you for joining me at today's webinar, 9/11, 2 decades later, hosted by the Vanderbilt Project on Unity in American Democracy. I'm Daniel Diermeyer, Chancellor of Vanderbilt University. Tomorrow marks the 20th anniversary of the attack on America that forever changed our world. Many of us recall well the horror of that day. In each year, we come together to remember the nearly 3,000 precious lives lost, to honor the great acts of our heroism that followed, and to reflect on the important lessons that this piece of history we share as Americans continues to teach. 9/11 tested our strength, and as we united as a nation in response, we saw the values that define us come to life. We saw these values in the heroic sacrifices that so many made to save others, from the passengers who had steered their own plane away from hijackers and into the ground, to the first responders who willingly rushed into buildings even as they collapsed. We saw them in the citizens who mobilized to support victims' families, who lined up to give blood, and who selflessly volunteered their time in the long and steady process of rebuilding. And we continue to see them now in the hands and hearts of everyone who stands up against violence and works towards peace. Today, the site of the Twin Towers is a symbol of compassion, redemption, and national strength. 20 years later, the lesson of 9/11 is one of unity, and of how our common values as Americans are stronger than the forces that seek to divide us. And this year's anniversary comes at a time when these values are tested, but needed more than ever. The Vanderbilt Project on Unity in American Democracy was founded upon this premise, and for that reason. In the wake of January's attack on the US Capitol, scholars at Vanderbilt responded to what we believed is one of higher education's most important responsibilities: to provide a global forum for evidence-based reasoning and constructive civil discourse. Since then, the Unity Project has sought to draw diverse voices into compelling conversations that can heal our divisions and move our nation ever forward. The project is co-chaired by former White House fellow and Vanderbilt Research Professor of Law and Political Science Samar, former Governor of Tennessee Bill Haslam, and Vanderbilt Professor and Presidential Historian Jon Meacham. Both Samar and Jon have joined us today, along with Vanderbilt legal scholar Ganesh Sitaraman. Thank you again for your attendance at today's event at Vanderbilt in memory of 9/11. I will now turn it over to Jon to introduce our panelists and begin the conversation.
Thank you, Chancellor. I'm Jon Meacham. I'm the Rogers Chair in the American Presidency at Vanderbilt, and my two colleagues are kind of like the Habsburg emperors. They have so many titles, it would take us a long time to go through them, but they're two amazing people and terrific colleagues. Samar Ali, my co-chair of the Unity Project, as the Chancellor mentioned, a research professor. We're teaching a class this semester. I'm hoping that she will carry the weight going forward. And Ganesh Sitaraman, who is a research professor of law at Vanderbilt, a longtime and important advisor to Senator Elizabeth Warren, and also a remarkable human being. So I'm honored to be here and to talk about a very solemn and unfolding story. This is an act of commemoration that is at once about the past, but also the present and the future. It is a organic experience of September 11th, the attacks on innocence, and the unfolding implications of that attack. So, Samar, we'll start with you. Where were you on Tuesday, September 11th, 2001?
Thank you, Jon. I was actually on Vanderbilt's campus as a student just starting my junior year at Vanderbilt in my dorm room on West End in Towers. I'll never forget the shock of it all and the evolution of emotions. I think we will all forever remember the shock at witnessing a terrorist attack, the shared concern for those killed and suffering, the heroism of the responders, and the questions we all had from those terrible events. I remember being woken up actually by my sister calling me after the first plane hit the towers and the World Trade Center and saying, "You have to turn on the television." And I got up and turned on the television, and it took me a minute to process that I wasn't actually watching a movie and that this was happening in New York City, and we were being attacked. And then as I was watching the television, I saw the second plane hit the World Trade Center, and my entire body froze. And it took me a moment to then realize that there were thousands of Americans, as you said, innocent civilians in those towers that were, as they were falling. And some of our questions at the time were immediate, including who, why, how, and what's next. As we evolved from these emotions that moved from shock to fear to grief. And some of our questions at the time were longer term, including how might the world, not just America, be protected from such events? And as a Muslim American, I had all those questions, like everyone. I was mortified and angry that people hijacked my religion and were doing this act of terror in the name of my religion.
Ganesh, where were you?
In some ways, my story is a little similar to Samar's. I was also in college. It was registration day, the day you set up for classes. And I remember my mom called and said, you've got to watch, there's a plane that just hit the World Trade Center in New York. And my immediate thought was, well, that can't be right. It must have been a mistake or just some sort of mechanical problem. These things aren't something that happens to us and here. And I think years later, reading some of the accounts of how others felt, the time in between the two planes, I think there was a sense of innocence that we all had from the 90s. Certainly, I think those of us who were young had a sense that this wasn't a thing that happens here. Terrorism, it was not something that you would contemplate as something that would happen. And then when the second plane hit, when you hear about the Pentagon, when you hear about the flight in Pennsylvania, you realize this is not a mistake. This is not just some error that happened. This is something totally different. And I think that Samar captured it really well, this kind of shock and questioning of so many different kinds. Why, how, what would happen next? And I think there was also a lot of questioning about just the randomness of fate. There were a lot of stories that I think we all heard and people we knew. If you knew people who lived in New York who missed a subway and so weren't there, or were a little delayed because their alarm clock went off late and they slept in. And just to think about the just astonishing consequences for so many people based on the small things that happen in our lives and what that could mean. And I think for most of the day, I think me, like many others, were just transfixed on television, watching and wondering. And I think that was itself a kind of challenging day. The other part of the uncertainty was just the fear in that day itself. I mean, I was in Boston, and there were reports that there might be further attacks that day in Boston, and so we really didn't know anything about what might happen. And so this deep sense of insecurity and fear, I think, was something that everyone felt, because it was a sense prior to that, I think, that we'd never really been vulnerable in that way, at least as young people. That wasn't part of our experience growing up in the 90s. And I think because, Jon, because you're moderating, I guess I should throw the question to you. Maybe you could tell us also about where you were that day.
Yeah, I was not in college. I'm much more elderly and wiser than my fellow panelists, which I don't think they stipulate enough. But I was at Newsweek in Manhattan. Tuesday was our Monday. The magazine used to publish overnight Saturday into Sunday. And so I was coming to work from the Upper East Side to Midtown. So I was very rarely in Lower Manhattan. And a colleague of mine said in the lobby of the building, then at 57th and Broadway, there's been some terrible accident at the Trade Center. And I didn't really know what that meant, and went upstairs to the 16th floor, and my experience, at least initially, was a lot like yours. I was oddly, I don't want to say fortunate, but I had to focus with this remarkable global team of people that I was lucky enough to work with on producing an issue of the magazine in 24 hours from the moment of the attack into, I think, Wednesday evening or Thursday morning. And so there was something for me to do. And it was about trying to explain Al-Qaeda. It was understanding the Taliban. It was making sure that the photographic record of this horrific massacre was as vivid as it could be, not only for pure journalistic purposes, but it was also an act of commemoration. And I remember feeling, and maybe you're not supposed to feel this, but I did. I remember feeling that our task in this moment was not simply to record. It was to try to explain. It was to try to honor the sacrifice of those people who, as you say, Ganesh, got on the subway, went to work, and found themselves combatants in a war they didn't know they were involved in. And so that was my first 36 hours or so. To be in Manhattan in those early weeks was riveting in many ways. I remember chillingly helping to dispatch a couple of reporters to the hospitals, and expected that to be a hugely important part of our coverage. And then they came back in the late afternoon because no one was being treated, because the victims were all dead. And I remember when those people returned, thinking that this was not a conventional act of warfare. This was not a conventional day. And as people know, Manhattan itself, the cloud, the dust from Ground Zero lingered for a long time. And that's the dark side, the reality. One small detail that's always stuck with me is, I want to say by Thursday or Friday, I could be wrong, it might be the next week, it's kind of a blur, but it was early the next week. The restaurants in Manhattan, the white tablecloth places, were all empty. The neighborhood pubs, the neighborhood bars were full. People wanted to be together. Mm-hmm. And there was a seriousness of purpose. There was an activated empathy that was self-evident. It was manifest in those weeks. And I think a lot of us hoped, prayed that that sense of activated empathy, that unity, would in fact bring a fractured country together. Because remember what politically and culturally where we were. Only 10 months before, the Supreme Court had stopped a recount in Florida and given the presidency to the person who did not win the popular vote. And there was an enormous amount of, it now feels quaint almost, but an enormous amount of sense of, could Bush govern as minority president? You know, again, it sounds as though I'm talking about Thermopylae, given where we are now. But that there was a sense of fracture. There was a sense that the country had chosen Vice President Gore to be president, but the system had awarded it to someone else. And all of that, at least in the interim, for a time, evaporated. And I think that in many ways, George W. Bush became president on that Friday after the attacks, when he delivered that, I think, remarkable homily at National Cathedral, and then of course came up to Manhattan, and then and intuitively reacted the way he did. no talking points with that bullhorn. That was him. And it captured something. It captured a sense of anger, but also a sense of resolve. And I'm wondering, and Samar, you take it from here. What part of this is retrospective, but what would have been your hopes? What were your hopes, and then now sort of what do you think historically should have been our hopes as a country, as a culture, coming out of the attacks? And also, what were your fears?
Right. Well, it's a great question. I would say my hopes, I actually gave a speech on Alumni Lawn here at Vanderbilt on September 13th, 2 days after the attacks. And I was asked to review that speech recently. And I read it, and it's really interesting because it captures exactly my hopes at the time and my hopes today, too, quite frankly, for our country. And it was simply asking us not to fight hate with hate, and to not let Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden succeed in dividing us as a nation and pitting us against each other in this friend versus enemy framework, to move Americans as neighbors coming together as in a pub and moving us from that experience into an experience of where we are in a very suspicious environment and we fear each other and we don't view all Americans as Americans. And my hope really was to avoid using language like we're on a crusade when we talked about our actions in Iraq and Afghanistan, to avoid framing of us versus them and this broad definition of who is them and the very limited definition of who is us. And being hypocritical, I was hoping that we would stay rooted in our democratic principles, and for those principles to guide both our domestic policies and our foreign policy. And we're in them, and my hope had been too, because as you remember, we were just at the beginnings of what we now call the Fourth Industrial Revolution, and the world was about to experience tensions because of that Fourth Industrial Revolution, that it contributed to tensions between urban and rural environments and jobs that were available, that we modeled a way forward for the world. And we said, fear is a natural emotion, but you get to choose how you respond to that fear. When someone attacks you, you get to choose. They don't get to decide for you who you are and who you're going to be. And my fears, many of them, quite frankly, have been realized, but I still have hope. And that's one of the reasons as to why I'm excited, honestly, truly, about doing this project with you, Jon, on unity and American democracy. That work gives me hope, because I don't think it's too late. I do think our country is at a crossroads right now, and we've been shaped and our identities have been defined by these past 20 years at war, but I don't think that it's too late. But on the point about what I have feared, I feared that this war on terror would expand from fighting Osama bin Laden. By the way, I was in the White House when we killed Osama bin Laden as a White House fellow in 2011. And I was thinking back on these past couple of days, was what we witnessed in Kabul, and as we've been winding down from Afghanistan, about how that was 10 years ago. And we continued fighting for a decade. What were we fighting? In the name of what? And which principles were guiding us?
Ganesh, what about you on the hopes and fears?
I think one of the great hopes that at the time I remember thinking was that in our history, we've had these moments where people have understood that they were living in history, that something big had happened, and that it was time for everyone to look outside of themselves, to step up and to contribute to the community, a sense of kind of national public service and being part of a connected project that stitches us all together. And I think in the first days after, to take your point, Jon, part of my hope was that what we saw that day, the ordinary and extraordinary heroism of people who were rushing in instead of rushing out, who were trying to help in every possible way they could, of people looking to family members, to friends, helping anyone and everyone they could. And just that sense, struck me as really what is the best of people in all of us. And that there was a moment and a hope that that's what maybe we as a nation would kind of be stirred to more broadly, is a kind of sense that we were called to unite and to do something and be more active in our leadership at home, our domestic renewal, our leadership in the world, and addressing terrorism was a thing that would do that in the same way that, in so many ways, when you look back at Pearl Harbor, it was a thing that galvanized the country, but not just on the war, but on a sense of how much we had to do at home in order to be able to be the kind of country that could address the challenge of fascism in the 40s. And I think that sense that this was that moment was, I think, one of the hopes that it would actually do something really promising about our values, in part because in the days after, it really showed the extraordinary character of so many people across the country. So I think that was the hope. I think on the fear side, I think my fears then, and maybe this is more looking back after many years and experiencing it, but I think some of the fear is that, some of the challenge would be ourselves. How do we react? And will we make the right decisions? And will we live our values in the process of going forward? And some of that touches on Samar's points about what exactly are our reactions going to be. And I think what we saw in the years after is some of the controversies, some of the places where we became more divided were precisely over the questions of our values and how we put those in practice in a challenging set of policy questions and in a complicated and dangerous world.
Let me challenge you a little bit. There's been an emerging conventional wisdom in the anniversary coverage that we failed somehow in our response to the attacks, that and the pieces of the Atlantic everywhere. If one test of a response was not to have a repeat of an attack on the homeland, that has in fact been the case. So I'm wondering where you all fall on this sense of, as part of our national security apparatus, as part of our projection of power and the price of that projection of power, was our national, and it is bipartisan at this point. How would you assess our reaction and its relative in foreign policy terms and security terms, its success or failure?
Ganesh, I'll let you go first. I've been going first.
Thanks. So, I think one thing that we've seen over the last 20 years is that there are a lot of tensions that we've had to manage as a country and that we have tried to navigate. One that comes up in the courses that I've taught and things that I've written about over the years is this question of civil liberties, national security, executive power versus checks and balances, transparency and oversight versus secrecy. And these are tensions that keep coming up, and they came up very frequently, and there were big debates about these questions in the 2000s. And particularly questions around, how far is too far, what works, what lives our values, and how do we navigate those things? So, you can think back to the torture memos, for example, highly controversial images from Abu Ghraib, and questions around, at the time, debates over, is this necessary? And you had some people arguing in the sort of 24 Kiefer Sutherland world that you have to do these kind of dark arts in order to keep the country safe. And then others arguing that actually not only is this not effective, it's actually deeply contrary to our lived values and degrades our standing in the world and our ability to lead and to have the kind of moral force. I think these were big debates that I think still probably people have different views about if we depending on who you ask. And in some ways, these debates maybe preface the divisions and polarization that has expanded over the years. So I think there are some things like that where when you dig into any particular area, there's, I think, still a lot of question about what would have been better. And one thing maybe Samar can speak to, having been in the White House for some time, but I think anyone who's worked in government or politics will say is, in the moment when you're making decisions, there are a lot of questions and I think almost every account I've read of lawyers and other folks who were in the Bush administration or in the Obama administration will say that, when you're faced with intelligence, when you're faced with challenging situations, there are a lot of things you have to make trade-offs on and try to think through. How much is pushing too hard? What are the risks of not doing anything? So I think for the leaders who are in these positions, they faced just an enormous amount of difficult questions and challenges on how to balance these competing needs and values. To me, I think the story is one actually of just the real complexity of leadership and difficulties, and how to manage what we all recognize as our core values, particularly when they're confronted with deep questions of security. And that to me is I think in some ways the pervasive thing that we have been struggling with in a lot of different areas.
Yeah, I think exactly. I think the how we've gone about this. Thankfully, we have not had another terrorist attack in 20 years of the magnitude. And I will say though we haven't gone through 20 years of peace though either. And there's been a lot of sacrifice and pain and trauma and harm that people have felt on almost every single American. I talk to people who are Muslims in this country. I talk to people who are veterans. I talk to people who have lost loved ones in Afghanistan and in Iraq. I talk to Iraqis, to Afghan civilians as well. And I would say we really do have to be introspective about what are the lessons that we've learned over the past 20 years and our response in the name of national security, and how have we politicized our national security apparatus? What has actually worked and what has been so over the top and extra, if you will, that it's not justifiable, like as Ganesh mentioned, what happened in Abu Ghraib, waterboarding, some of the torture that happened in our name. And that goes to this point where I think it's safe to say you really can't have national security and an effective national security apparatus without respect for human rights. And I think that gets to also what it means to be a democracy and deciding that we're not going to be a police state, deciding about how we're going to respond with a proportionate response, again, that's guided by our democratic principles and values.
Just to jump in there, one of the things that, is interesting to see that happened over the 20 years is also how people in our own military and national security establishment changed their views about things. So, in the earlier stages, there's a sense that this kind of warfare, whether it was Afghanistan and then later Iraq, was a kind of killing and capturing as the predominant mode. And then around 2007, you have General Petraeus and a number of folks who support a more counterinsurgency mission. And they write this counterinsurgency field manual that says, actually, that is the wrong approach. And the right approach is about winning over the population. This is about winning hearts and minds. It's not, and at any time you engage in military action that may kill civilians, you actually might create more terrorists and insurgents than you would have otherwise. And so the approach has to be one in which our values, our hopes are aligned with the work that we're doing. There was then, some years later, a push away from that kind of approach as too expansive. Nation building is very expensive, it's very difficult to do, and so on. And then a move to more narrow and targeted approaches, focus on drone strikes and how can we be so precise that there's no collateral damage, but we're also not doing the kind of nation building that was aspired to in a slightly earlier phase. And so I think as we've seen these shifts, it's astonishing looking back in some ways just to see how much the government moved and people moved in what the aims were, what the modes of how to go about doing these things were. And in some ways, I think, John, that gets to your question, how to define what counts as successful has shifted over time in different ways. And at sometimes, people, at least some set of people interpreted that as a more democracy promotion or nation building efforts. Other times it was just homeland defense. And so I think one of the challenging questions in looking back is, as a country, what are our goals in national security? And do we see that as simply homeland defense, which is something I think no one disagrees that is the primary goal. But what about these other goals, and how far do we go in those directions? And I think that has been something that, especially this month and last month with Afghanistan, that I think people have been debating more and more than in the last few years.
Yeah. Let me offer you my sort of barstool statement, and you all, as we would say in the classroom, assess the validity of this statement. Most foreign policy doctrines are retrospective. Foreign policy, like life, tends to be improvisational. You decide things, you might do something on the margins that is in keeping with an articulated principle, but by and large, politics, policy, like life, is more contingent and conditional. The Bush doctrine is a great example, Ganesh, what you were just saying. I mean, it starts out as full-on counterterror. It becomes counterinsurgency. Iraq was, beginning in 2003, initially was a homeland security, ally security mission to remove weapons of mass destruction and an unreliable actor. When that went to the wayside, it became a democracy promotion. Always articulated early on, but I think it was like the fourth point. If, as people wrestle with, as you say, particularly in the wake of the Afghanistan withdrawal, can there be a guiding doctrine? And if so, what should it be? Samar, you go first. Well, I want the Samar doctrine.
I do think, absolutely. And I think it's guided by our Constitution and by our democratic principles. I think that this view of our principles stop at our border isn't, we're not doing ourselves justice by thinking that that's the case or that it has to be that way. And I think that we need to show and model leadership starting with our own domestic policies. Not to just promote Ganesh's work, but it's really important. He's written a book about the middle class and the middle class constitution. I think that that's an important concept that we should talk more about. And one of the things that makes our democracy so special too is how much we focus on supporting the middle class and those institutions that we should talk more about. But not going too much off the reservation here on your question, to think that people who are not Americans are subhumans or deserve less or are aliens, I think is just wrong, quite frankly. And to think that they want something different, there was this rhetoric around clash of civilizations, and there can be no reconciliation with the other, and they have a different way of life that we can't reconcile with. I think we're just fooling ourselves, and that we have to come back to basics, and that we're dealing with human beings, and we have to think about in what ways do we deal with people. What are the incentives that we can also create through our policies? And Madeleine Albright, after being Secretary of State, talked a lot about this, actually, as to whether or not, when she was in the Clinton administration, if it was the right thing to do to sanction Iraq, if it actually hurt the Iraqi people more than it hurt Saddam Hussein, and thinking about what are the tools in our toolbox diplomatically, so that we can live our principles abroad and here at home.
So I think one of the questions
about what's the Ganesh doctrine?
Yeah, well, one of the challenges around doctrines just in general is that if you're a decision maker in foreign policy or domestic policy, you know, as you said, John, you're making a lot of decisions that feel at times maybe improvisational. There's a lot of different factors at play. And I think the desire for a doctrine is the desire to be able to articulate some bigger set of principles, mission, or vision that is going to guide how you do decision making in any given case. So you're at least, you know, pointing towards a North Star, even if the ship is tacking slightly right or slightly left at any given moment. And the challenge is, if you don't have one, you may still be under the influence of something that is effectively a kind of worldview. It's just maybe one that is not quite articulated. And I think that's why it's easier almost for us to see them looking backwards than it is for us to articulate them in the moment. And there's a big debate about whether it's even possible to have such doctrines or grand strategies in the moment. You know, my view tends to be that trying to articulate something is helpful, in part because it can be the kind of aligning force that helps people point to, you know, this is the mission that we have, this is what we're trying to do, when they're thinking about any given particular situation. And that the debate over what that doctrine should be is actually a really healthy one for a society, especially a democratic society, to engage in, because it forces us to make choices and to think about our values and to think about the dangers and constraints and challenges that we face. So I've written, you know, that one thing we should be thinking about today is a grand strategy focused on resilience. You know, in a world where we are facing pandemics and climate change and economic competition globally, being a resilient country at home, being able to weather all of these different types of challenges is already and is going to be critical, and that may be an organizing principle that we could think through, that could shape a lot of our policies, domestic and foreign. You know, other people obviously disagree with that and think that there are other things that should be our organizing principles. But you know, looking back, I think you're right, John, that a challenge is, you know, when you're in the middle of it, to be able to make these decisions. I think this is also what the kind of crisis sprung upon you in some ways makes it even more challenging, because, you know, if you're people in the White House in the days, weeks, months after September 11th, there's not a lot of time to be sitting back in your armchair and thinking big, grand thoughts about what, you know, philosophies and strategies should look like at that kind of level. There is moment to moment, 24/7 work that also has to be done. So it is a challenging thing, I think, for people, especially in government, to do this when a crisis hits. But I think it's also something, therefore, that's important for academics, for people on the outside, for journalists to be thinking and talking about, because, you know, you have the ability to step a little bit outside of the fog and hopefully see some greater clarity.
I just wanted to add on that really quickly, from that minute-to-minute crisis mode of when you're having to respond to various attacks, and to just say, like, in those moments, yes, it is 24/7. It is very stressful. There is a lot of pressure, which is why it's so important, I think, to have consensus around what are the guiding principles and values. How far is too far in terms of how we respond? Understanding what the motivations are, making sure that our systems are functioning and working properly. And that includes communication between the State Department, between the Pentagon, with the CIA, with the FBI, with the White House. And that's why the functionality of our government becomes so important. And I think the rhetoric and how we communicate what is being done to the American people and the public, and avoiding, as tempting as it might be, especially in an election cycle, to overly dramatize or make even further polarize and create a partisan rhetoric around decisions that are rooted in foreign policy. And I just say, like, one other thing, and that is to think about how our allies are perceiving us, and how our allies are looking for direction from us, and in trying to understand what is U.S. foreign policy. Because to simply say it's a day-to-day approach and we're just responding to what's happening doesn't really inspire a lot of confidence. And it doesn't encourage people to follow our leadership. And I think what we really have to think strongly about this decade in particular is, what kind of leadership do we want to model for ourselves, for our allies, and for the world? How do we build trust, and how do we put a foreign policy strategy out there that speaks for itself and people follow?
So here's an unfair question, but that's why I'm here. The attacks of September 11th, 2001 unfolded in an America which was divided, which we had a president, again, a minority popular vote president in the office. But trust in institutions and an embrace of the basic constitutional norms were different and firmer than they are today. Here's a counterfactual hypothetical, which I know academics love. What do you think would happen today, given our partisan polarization, the rise of illiberalism, the distrust of any information coming from someone with whom you disagree? What do you think? Is America equipped today to respond in a coherent fashion to a devastating attack, given the political and cultural experience of the last 20 years, and even arguably of the last 9 months? Don't jump in at once. Ganesh, you go first.
Well, I think one of the things that I think I and many others have been surprised about is the degree of the degree of polarization and in the pandemic context that we're in now. I would not have guessed that, even with the kind of well-documented polarization that existed prior to the pandemic and expanding over a number of years. I would have thought a kind of public health crisis of the type that we're in now would have been something slightly beyond that. And I think that is worrying, certainly, in terms of how other crises of whatever type might come about. At the same time, it may be that there's something just distinctly different about an attack, in that there is an element in which being attacked from the outside by someone else does have a different feature of building psychologically a kind of community cohesion that an unseen virus may not. And so, maybe there's a distinction there that is possible, but I certainly was surprised at the reaction, the kind of polarized reactions to the pandemic, which suggests, as I think you implied in your question, that maybe the reaction would be different than it was in 2001 if something similar happened today.
Let me say this: the 9/11 conspiracy theories were marginal
Mm-hmm.
in 2001 forward. I hate to say this. In a way, it breaks my heart to say it, but I can see very influential propaganda outlets arguing about culpability
Yes.
of an administration
Yes.
to sow chaos and to win partisan advantage.
Power.
I mean, maybe I'm being too dark here, and so y'all tell me. But one of the things I think we have to work on, and one of the things we are working on, is can there be an assent, an acceptance of the basic rules of the road,
Mm-hmm.
meaning evidence, fact, logic, as well as the rule of law, to make potentially controversial decisions, but to make coherent decisions.
Yes.
And I worry that today, I mean, the idea, here's maybe a better way to put it. George W. Bush, in the fall of 2001, went from having gotten 49% of the popular vote to having a 90+ approval rating. I don't think that would happen today.
I don't think it would happen today either, and I do think there's reasons to be worried, and about these about the conspiracy theories that would ensue, and the reasons behind those conspiracy theories, and who's fueling them and who's seeking to benefit from them. There's lots to be worried about. I think at the same time, there's a lot to be optimistic about, and I do believe that, again, mentioning this, we're in the fourth industrial revolution here. We're dealing with disinformation. We're dealing with misinformation. We've got a digital public square that we haven't figured out yet quite how to manage appropriately, to build resiliency around democracy and democratic principles. We're figuring out how to communicate effectively, to build consensus, to move people away from authorizing environments for cruelty and towards ones that are more productive as a society. That said, too, though, I would argue that we've learned a lot of lessons over the past 20 years. We have a lot of technocrats, we have a lot of people in government right now who have seen what has happened from some bad decisions that we've made, and are working to develop better policies. And we have people who are very skilled diplomats. And so I think that it's complex. And I think that there's a daily conversation right now that's taking place within government and outside government about how we can better communicate with each other in ways of where we embrace this concept of unity, so that we are stronger, particularly in this moment of we're not only at a crossroads domestically, but I would argue internationally, we're at a crossroads.
Well, on that cheerful note, let's close out by giving our listeners a sense of what guides us. Are there books, documentaries, things you all recommend about the attacks, about the aftermath, that people could profitably engage with? Samar, you go first.
Yeah, I would actually say that there's a book that I highly recommend that Amartya Sen wrote in 2003, 2004 on identity. And it's The Illusion of Destiny is the name and the title of the book. And I think that right now, Americans are struggling with what it means to belong in America today. And so much of our identity has been framed by the past 20 years that we need to take a step back, need to read that book and ask ourselves that question of, what does it mean to be an American today? And what do I want it to mean tomorrow? And how can we come together and work towards that vision?
Ganesh, besides the middle class constitution, what should people read?
There's a journalist named Garrett Graff who has an oral history of September 11th, which is an extraordinary book, and really an extraordinary achievement for history to really have brought together so many accounts. in one place of this of such a horrifying and important historical moment. So I'd recommend that. On the sort of pre 9/11, there was a terrific book by Steve Cole called Ghost Wars, which I'd recommend to anyone who's interested in learning about what was happening beforehand and the CIA's operations and Al Qaeda's development in the pre 9/11 days. In the aftermath, there's just been so many books and so many different accounts, and so I would recommend to people to try to read a mix of things. There have been a number of great journalistic accounts of decision making in the Bush administration and in the Obama administration. Woodward has a series of books on those questions. Journalists have done an amazing job of writing as well about all of the different phases and elements of this. Dexter Filkins had a great book called The Forever War, which is one that stood out to me at the time as well. So that's at least a starting point for folks who are looking for a reading list.
That's great. I have two thoughts, one specific, one general. This will be the only time, arguably, in the history of the 21st century where someone will recommend a government report. But the report of the 9/11 Commission is worth reading.
Yeah.
It's a remarkable piece of narrative work, richly documented. It is in its way a landmark for unity. It was a bipartisan, honest, unflinching. If there are competing accounts, they put the competing accounts down, but they tell you what they think is true. And in that sense, it's a good model for what we need to do in our daily and diurnal lives. The other is anything at all that you can embrace and engage with on the passengers of Flight 93 in the skies over Pennsylvania. They did something that I suspect all of us like to think we would do, but I'm not sure. They took that, they gave their lives for others. They knew that they were going to die, but they thought it was important to make that sacrifice so that others might live. And there's nothing more human in the best sense than that. Ganesh, Samar, thank you. Thank you to all of you for joining us. I hope we don't have to do this again to commemorate an attack, but history happens, and what we're trying to do at Vanderbilt and the Unity Project is find a way for us to, in fact, move forward toward that more perfect union. So thank you all for joining us.